cool. So theoretically, this won't be totally awful. We shall see. All right, so the first thing, so when you start modeling an object, ideally you're going to start working from what's called orthographic images. If any of you, wait, oh no. Oh, here we go. So orthographic images are usually images taken from the front, side, and top of each of your objects. So like, this is actually a horrible example of orthographics. Give me, okay, hot glue gun, those are pretty decent. So like for the hot glue gun, you can see I have an image taken like from the side of the object that's as close to flat as I can get it. I have another one from the back of the glue gun, the front of the glue gun, and then I always just take a few extra because it helps me see like the little nooks and crannies that sometimes the orthographics don't show as well. So ideally when you use your orthographic images, they should be crisp, clear, and visible. So like you can see here, like all of the detail is visible in this. I did take, for grins, some terrible orthographic images just to show you what not to do. So like the first thing you can do is try to take an orthographic image where like, can you guys see this? Okay. Okay. But like this pen is so blurry, like there's no way that you can realistically expect to see what's happening with that. So like make sure your object is in focus. Here the lighting is like so, it's both out of focus and the lighting on the back part is so bad that it like fades into black and you can't see it. That's my cat. Don't know why that's in there. He's so cute. Okay. Like here, I've taken a bunch of images before where it's like the lighting is like so bad. Like obviously don't have your object backlit so the whole thing is just a silhouette. Unless you need the silhouette, in which case backlight your thing. But and then stuff like here's another version where I was actually trying to take pictures of my little microphone, where it's a black object and it's not lit well, so you just can't really see what the heck anything is in this. But I tried. So that's some just examples of terrible, terrible orthographic images. But anywho, so once you actually go into Maya, set your project, you can actually import these images directly into Maya. So I'm going to go to my little 4 planes view thing. And if you go click on, you'll see that each of these different menus has like their own little panel of controls here. So you can pretty much manipulate each one separately. So like I'm going to find the side image of my orthographic. So I'm going to go to View, Image Plane, Import Image. And then since I have my project set, it usually looks for, by default, it'll look for any images in your source image folder. So you can see I just like have all of these in my source images just hanging out. What am I doing? You said hole punch? Cool. That looks acceptable for side view, sort of. So I'll just like find my image and then import that. And you can see that there's now a giant plane hanging out in my scene with the image on it. So you just pretty much go through and you go just import the images for all of your different angles that you have. I need to fish through because I 100% don't remember. I did not label these at all. That was the front view. Not sure what the heck. I don't know. I'll get a top view, which I don't know. We're just gonna run with this for now. And then I usually, when possible, I also usually just end up leaving like the hole puncher. I'll like leave these images pulled up to the side, then I can just like open them in tabs and just use them to like reference it for like the other angles and stuff. So I'm actually going to. This is weird having dual monitors. I kind of like it. Anyway, all right. So now that your images are in Maya, you can actually you can manipulate these pretty much like you would a normal object. So like if I click on this and bring up my rotate handle, I can rotate this around. And my goal in doing this is to just make it relatively straight and not at an angle, because I do not feel like modeling things at an angle. You can also go into, I know when I learned how to make orthographic images, they're like, yes, put everything into Photoshop and line it up perfectly in Photoshop and then bring that image in. I'm way too lazy to do that, so I just line it up in Maya. So one thing I sometimes I'll do is I'll just make like a sort of generic, gross, hang on. I'll just make like a generic sort of measuring stick-esque object. What are you doing, Maya? And I'll just like use that to basically measure and align my images with each other. This is quite awkward. Oh, I see what I did. Oh, that was dumb. I put the side image, it should have been on the top. Whoops. And this is why they probably tell you to put stuff in Photoshop. All right. Close enough. All right, so I just deposited a different image in, and I'm actually gonna get rid of this one. All right. Cool. So now I'm pretty much just using this little cube here to kind of align the images with each other and make sure that they match. And it looks like this top image is a little bit big. You can see here's the edge of the cube, and then here's where the image ends. So I'm just going to take it and scale it down ever so slightly, and then shift it over. And I'm going to call that good enough for the purposes of this demonstration. So that's pretty much how you get image planes or reference images into your Maya scene. Later, when you're doing your animation classes, you're going to be doing that with like videos. But yeah. You can also, so like I personally find it super distracting to have these in the perspective view. So I usually just like move them out of the way, and then if you go to show image planes, you can just turn them off in that particular view. It's just like, it really doesn't matter functionally, it's just how I prefer to work. If you want them back at any point, you just go to show and then recheck the image plane thing. Cool. And then I also, again, find the grid really distracting, so I usually turn that off. Because I dislike it. Again, totally personal preferences. But so I guess for grins, I'm just going to start with the handle because it's the most self-explanatory part of this. And I'm going to start with a cylinder, which I will just rotate 90 degrees. And this is going to be, so like for the record, this is not, I'm not going to try to recreate this exactly. I'm just like hoping to maybe show you guys some like process things and like different tools that will help you when you model whatever your own objects are. Again, if at any point anyone has questions, just stop and let me know. I'll be modeling, so like just yell out like and be like, I have a question, and I will do my best to answer it. Anywho, so like for the handles, I'll just start here. I'll select to give some length to handles. So I'll just select these faces at the very edge. I'll do an extrude. And then I'm pretty much just going to drag these along the side of the handle. And then maybe scale a little bit. So like once I get in here, and I'm just hitting G to repeat the last command, in this case extrude. So I'll just kind of keep doing that. Get it to be perhaps the rough shape-esque sort of thing that maybe looks like the end of this handle. And then I'll just scale that down, and I will call that good for that end for now. So the one thing that you want to be aware of, which I do a lot of times without meaning to, just because I'm being spacey and I'll forget, so like right now, if you're working in orthographic, it's really, really easy to forget that because like you can't see the top and bottom. So like if I were to take this edge loop, if I were to select this edge loop and I were to scale it like this, it's also scaling, you'll see like up and down. So like this part's getting really, really thick and like kind of wonky looking. And that's just like something to keep in mind, because I always forget that that's a thing when I'm working in orthographic mode, and then I'll get back into my perspective mode and everything's like super wiggly and awful looking. Anywho, so this would be probably something that's like reasonably not awful for like the basic shape of the pliers. I'll go back and do some proper shaping later. The next easiest thing to do would probably be, so a lot of times for like bolts and things like that, like this little nubby peg thing there, I'll just make a sphere and then drag that up. Okay. So I'll make a sphere and then I'll just flatten the crap out of it. So you can see here, like here's my little bolt guy that I'm trying to sort of replicate, which is not at all to scale. I'm notoriously bad at lining up orthographic images. But I'll just scale that up and bring it maybe into approximate position. And then what I'll do is I'll literally just drag, like marquee select the entire bottom of this sphere, do an extrude, and then I will scale it in like this. Did I show you guys last week? I'll go over it again, because even if I did go over it, probably everyone forgot anyway. So there's a way you can scale on all but one axis, which is what I did here. So normally, like if you would just grab, you know, like this little axis, or like the yellow square in the center of the gimbal, it would scale everything. Yeah. If you grab like just this one, I'll show you from perspective view as well. And if you scale like just the yellow one, it would only scale the yellow. If you control and click on the axis you do not want to scale, it'll basically scale the other two axes. So in this case, it's a really convenient way to come through and say, cool, I want this to be in line with where it was before, but not scaled in, but not flattened, if that makes sense. I feel like I just explained that super weird. And then, so actually, I think what I'm actually going to do is change tacks a little bit. I'm going to do both sides of the screw at once. So it's pretty much like one screw that goes through the entire image and like through the hole puncher and holds the punch together. So here's the shape, like the outer shape for both sides. If I take this sort of inside nub here and I extrude that one more time, and again scale, if I control click on the y-axis, it'll scale on all of them but the y-axis. And now you can see that it's pretty much made the shape of the screw going through the entire little nub. Does that kind of make sense? Cool. If anyone is ever accidentally, like they're working on Maya, and they happen to see, so like see how everything is sort of like yellow and then goes to a gradient of red? If anyone ever finds that and they don't want that on, so like if I click, you can see I'm just trying to move a single vertice, but it's dragging the whole thing around really crazy. That's called soft select. If you hit B, it will toggle it on and off. Sometimes I actually like it for stuff. And you can actually access it for, excuse me, for any of the different attributes. If you just double click on their little tool handle thing, it'll pull up, you know, your settings, and there should be a box for soft selection under there, and you can modify, so if I turn it on real quick, you can modify the fall off of the object, fall off radius, etc., which, there we go, just updates very slowly. You can edit any of that in there. Yeah, soft select is helpful sometimes. I just noticed like sometimes people like turn it on by accident, like, oh my god, what is this? How do I turn it off? So that is soft select. Cool. And then, all right. So a lot of times, depending on the object that you make, since this one is pretty much like, if you look at it in the images, it's pretty much just more or less it looks like it was created as flat pieces of metal that were kind of bent to be in the shape that they want. So you have one piece of metal that's like looped like this and then bent around to have some handles. So in this case, for something like this, a lot of times I'll actually just start with a plane, and I'll just create a plane without a million subdivisions. And I'll just start working from that. There's a bunch of different ways you could start creating a shape like this, but this is just like one of those weird sort of personal preferences, how I do it kind of thing. So what I would do is probably just put in like a basic plane that's like sort of the shape of what I'm doing. And then again, extrude tool is like kind of my favorite thing ever. So I'll just extrude the basic shape of the handle down. Keep extruding. You'll notice, so in the image, it might be kind of hard to see, but there's a bend in the metal that sort of comes up, and it's like a little bit rounded. So I'm actually I'm just gonna model the flat part of this piece first, because then it's really easy. Like it's starting from a plane, it's gonna be perfectly flat, and then I'll come back in and I'll add this little bent bit later. Again, I just think it kind of is like a little bit easier to work like that. And then again, just sort of extrude, keep extruding. All right, close enough for now. But so close. All right, and then the other thing, so like when you're working in orthographic mode, you'll notice that this is started off at 0 on the y-axis. So I'm just going to drag this up so it's slightly closer to wherever the other, or like the start of this piece, where I think the start of this piece is. All right, so if I forgot how like OCD I am with like modeling stuff. Oh god. Cute. Shift these into space. So if it were, I guess, to make this sort of little bent piece here, what I would do is just select a few faces, and I'm actually going to once again extrude these, and I will just go into my perspective camera a little bit and just pull them down a little bit, and then I'll just sort of slowly. I like working in vertex mode. I don't really know why, but you can see now that there's like a little bit of very awkward shaped bend in this. It would also be good to go through and actually make these even. But that's how I would create like the super basic like bent area in that, and it looks like this might have come up a little bit more. Just kind of keep moving stuff up like this. A lot of modeling is like honestly like those of you that use it's pretty much just like picking away at small silly details until you have something that like actually resembles an object. And then like here it looks like you can see there's a little bend in the side of this, so I'm just going to go to my Vertex Select mode. You can do faces, edges, really doesn't matter. And I will just drag these up ever so slightly and drag these maybe down, and you can see now it's like sort of matching the bend in my object. This is also another time where I would actually perhaps like to use soft select, because I could just grab and be like whoop, and it'll a lot of times make a little bit smoother bend than me just sitting there trying to like manipulate all the vertices at once. Any questions on anything I've done so far? Cool. I love that you guys are just like, yeah, do the hole puncher. Like, wow, these are really obnoxious orthographics to just like wing. But anyway, so cool. Turn off soft select because I don't want that on. I'm just gonna go through and like do a few more extrudes in here, and then I'm gonna start extruding down and working on this sort of curve, this rounded bit here. So I'll just bring these extrudes down and call that more or less all right. I'll grab these vertices here and pull those down a bit. And then, cool. Excuse me. And this is, so here is an example of my orthographic images not being lined up super well. For the purposes of right now, I'm just gonna wing it. Realistically, winging it is probably fine most of the time. But like you can see that like, here this loop matches up with the edge of my image here, but it's clearly far too long on this image. But like, for now, shrugs. If you ever end up doing freelance work and a client sends you pictures and they're like, model this, they're never gonna be perfect, well set up orthographic images. So it's, in my opinion, not terrible to learn to have to just sort of wing it. And like fudge it and make Maya do something that looks like what you want. But yeah. Cool, so that's sort of like a halfway decent basic shape for this perhaps. And then what I'm going to do now is just, so you can see I have like an extra edge of polygons running along this length. I'm just going to kind of extend that a little bit. So I'll just, again, do extrudes. Extrudes are like my favorite thing ever. I'll just scale this entire thing down. One tool that I tend to use a lot, so like if you, like I just did, if you extrude something and then extrude something else and like these objects or these faces aren't connected right here, if you just select both vertices and go to, I usually just use the button, but it's merge to center, it will attach those vertices so they're not random separate faces anymore. You can also go to that through edit mesh and merge to center. So that's a super helpful tool, especially once you get into, I guess, more complex models. That'll probably become like one of your best friend tools. So really quick, I'm just going to actually, just gonna line this up like a wee bit better. Close enough. All right, so that's like kind of a not terrible shape for the side of, for this side of the object. So what I'm going to do now, there's really no point in remodeling this entire side since I have it done. So what I'm going to do is actually just do a, all right, so my goal is to basically duplicate this side of the object onto the other side of the object. Maya doesn't have a super fantastic default way to just do this, which still kind of bothers me, honestly. Pretty much every other modeling program does. But, so what basically my goal is to, I'm just going to duplicate it and then scale it -1 in the Y direction. But you'll notice right now I have a bunch of crazy values here. What I'm going to do is just, if you go to, I'm going to freeze all the translations on this. So there's a button for it here. For freeze translations, you can see when I click it, it'll set all of the translates and rotates to 0, and all of the scales to 1. You can also go to, if you're in your channel box, you can also just right-click and go to freeze, and then here you can select translate, rotate, scale, or all. So like sometimes I only want to freeze scale, or only want to freeze translate. That's usually how I do that there. So now that this is scaled, so for the sake of argument, if I duplicated this object now and scaled it -1, you'll notice that it is not exactly where I want it. I was hoping it to duplicate around basically 0, 0 or the ground plane. So what I'm going to do, pretty much the same old stuff as last week with vert snapping the pivots, because it's like kind of a magical thing. So I'm just going to hold down D to access the pivot controls, and then hold down X to snap to grid. And I'm just going to snap that pivot to the grid. So now when I duplicate this object and scale it -1, you can see that it duplicates perfectly around the grid. What I am going to do now is actually freeze, again, I freeze the scale. If you ever, I have found many times it is good to not leave objects with negative scales. Sometimes it just causes like weird viewer display issues. So I've made it a practice to not leave stuff with negative scales. Namely, what will happen is you'll scale it and then it'll end up being like this really weird, see how this is like super black? Like this side is gray and this side is black. That's because of what's called normals. So the computer basically needs a way to decide which side is the front of the plane. What is the front side of this flat object I'm viewing, and it does that with normals. So whichever direction the normal is pointing is the quote-unquote front of basically your plane. And sometimes like when you scale it, it will reverse your normals, and then you'll end up with a black object like this. If that ever happens to you, just go to Mesh Display, Reverse. It's under the Normals tab, and it will reverse your normals and a lot of times like fix the issue. This also happens sometimes, like if I were to make a plane and just like extrude the whole plane, but I scale the faces down instead of up. You can see it just makes the cube totally black because it's basically scaled in the opposite way the computer expected. So again, just mesh control, mesh display, reverse. Wow. And control 1, in case anyone was not aware of it, is isolate select, which is super helpful if you have like a bunch of stuff in your scene and you just want to work on one item. Just do control 1, it'll display only that item. Or you can go to show, isolate select, and view selected. But again, I like hotkeys. They added that one in my 2018 and I got like super excited about it. Anywho. So, now that I have these two images, like clearly this is kind of awful and does not look like a single piece of anything. So what I'm going to do is, my end goal is to get rid of some of this extra geometry in here, and then go through and connect the objects together and make that bridge nicer. So what I'm actually going to do, if you go to Mesh, Combine, it'll take these two separate objects and turn them into a single object. Now you notice if you double click on the faces, it'll select all of the faces that are connected to each other. So if I double click, it's still basically two separate islands of places. They're now just behaving as one object. So if I go to object mode and select this, it'll select all of the faces. They're just not connected together yet, if that makes sense. And Maya has, I don't know why. Possibly because I'm evil. But Maya does actually, and they recently, in 2018, it took them 18 versions of Maya to finally add a symmetry tool. You can turn on symmetry on this object. So if you like select the faces up here, it'll automatically select the faces down there and mirror all of your changes. I don't know. Me being the weirdo I am, I still feel like it's good to know how to do things without symmetry if it's not available, but like symmetry is lovely, and in this case, makes it quite easy to just go through and delete all of these faces. So I just got rid of all the extra geometry. Now I want to connect these two pieces. There are two ways to do this. Two reasonable ways, I think, to do this. The first is with the bridge tool, which sometimes symmetry doesn't work with, so I'm going to turn that off real quick. So if you select these two edges at the top and these two edges at the bottom, go to Edit Mesh, Bridge. You'll see that it'll connect these two faces like this. And then it'll give you a bunch of different settings for like how many divisions do you want in here, twist, etc. Weird. There are two main things to be aware of if you're using the bridge tool. One is it only works on the same number of edge loops, which is kind of annoying. So like if I wanted to bridge like this top part to the bottom part, and I selected these 3 loops and tried to bridge them to these bottom 2 loops, so G for bridge, I don't know if you can see it, but it's like poly bridge edge requires equal numbers of border edges. So like you can only do 2 loops to 2 loops, 3 loops to 3 loops, 127 loops to 127 loops, etc. Yes, I've had to do that before. It's very annoying. So that's the first way to do that, is with the bridge tool. The second thing you can do is go to Mesh Tools, Append to Polygon. And this lets you pseudo draw in geometry. So if I click on this edge here, and then click on this edge down here, it'll basically draw in a polygon. In this case, they both do effectively the same thing. They all have their place. Like obviously, if you're connecting 127 edge loops, you don't want to sit there and append 127 loops, because that's ridiculous. In that case, definitely use bridge. If it's like 2 loops, sometimes I'll do append to polygon just because I like it better for some reason. Sometimes the bridge tool breaks really badly. It's like kind of one of those things where it's like the more you use them, it'll like make sense, and you'll kind of develop your own workflow for how you want to use stuff. So any questions on that? Cool. First one was symmetry. Yes. Yeah, so I just made this extra guy for the sake of example, but yeah, so if you're using the bridge tool or the append to polygon tool, that only works on like a single object. So like if I were to, fine, I'll use your weird planes. If I were to make two planes like this, I'm just gonna isolate select those. So right now these are two separate objects, right? Like they can be moved individually. So if I wanted to do like a append to polygon on this, I would click the edge. It'll actually highlight, so any pink edges is an edge that you can append to the polygon, and you'll notice that none of the loops on the other object are selected. And then the same thing will happen, append to polygon will also let you do weird stuff like that. Don't know why you'd want to, but. So, and the same thing's gonna happen with bridge. So like if I try to select an edge loop here, and I go to edit mesh bridge, doesn't work with multiple objects selected. So even though you can actually select edge loops on two separate objects at the same time, the tool won't let you bridge them because they're two separate objects. So what you do, just select both objects, and go to mesh, combine. And now you can see that the pivot has centered itself between the objects, and if I click it, I can move them both at the same time. So now if I wanted to, I could grab these edge loops and do bridge, or I could do an append. This is gonna be a really weird append, but like I could do an append like that, etc. Does that make sense? Okay. If you ever decide that you want to separate your objects again and they're not connected by a bunch of faces, you can, what am I saying? Click on your object and just go to mesh separate. You can see that now they're both their own objects again. I do that, I use that like so much when I'm modeling, just for like, I don't know, just kind of everything. I combine and separate my meshes willy-nilly. It's ridiculous. Anywho, so this is pretty much the rough shape of this object. Yes, I see. Okay. Weird. Cool. So looking at these images, wait, any other questions before I go on? Cool. So looking at these images, it looks like this sort of part here is connected, and then it just sort of goes into nothingness over there, which is a very awkward description. Cool. Let me see if I can find. Okay, cool. So you can see here's like the flat bit, and then the curved bit, and then it looks like these faces sort of connect to each other over here. And it stops maybe about here. So what I'm going to do is actually just go back to my append polygon tool, because it's like my favorite tool, and I don't know why. And I'm just going to append these somewhat aggressively. Call it a day. Append this guy here. And then I'm actually just going to bridge the rest because I'm lazy. So I think the more I work with Maya, the more I get like sort of nice selecting workflows going. So in this case, I wanted to select the top and bottom loops, so I just double-clicked to select the whole ring of edge loops here in this opening, and then I just Control and Marquee selected to get rid of the side loops. And then if I go to what the heck? If I go to a bridge, it'll connect them here, and you can see now I have sort of a piece of hole punch. The next thing I'm going to do is, so like obviously this hole punch, it needs a hole where the punch can punch through. I've recently figured out like the best tool ever for this, which I'll get to in a second. But I'm actually just going to add another edge loop in here because I realized it would be helpful to have, and I'll just make that flat, and I'm going to X hold down X to just vert snap that because I want it to be exactly in the center of this object. Having things perfectly centered makes your life much easier. So it's sort of become my practice that I do that. There is another tool that's super helpful if you want edge loops equally spaced apart from each other on an object. Which again, now there's like sort of two ways to do that. The first is to use the offset edge loop tool. So mesh tools, offset edge loop. So instead of having to manually click on each side and like make an edge loop, you just click on an edge loop and it'll pretty much add bordering edge loops around it. So it will add one on either side and it'll try to space them as equally as it can depending on your geometry. Alternately, because if your object is symmetrical, you can turn on symmetry and just insert an edge loop like you would normally. So if I put an edge loop on the top, it's going to put a duplicate edge loop on the bottom. Symmetry is good. I do like symmetry when it doesn't explode. Cool. And I can't see where the actual hole is on any of my reference images, so in this case, I'm literally just going to delete these faces here and say, cool, my hole is here. Yay. To actually make this into a hole, I'm going to turn off symmetry. There is a tool that sometimes works very nicely and sometimes does not. So we'll see what happens. But it's called circularize. And it'll pretty much, if you have a collection of vertices or edge loops selected, and you hit this tool, it'll turn them into a perfect circle. And like I said, sometimes it works really well. Like in this case, it did great things. Sometimes it does not work as well. Sometimes, like if you had, I don't know. Sometimes it does very odd things to your geometry, which I'm sure at some point you'll use it and be like, ooh, wow. Like sometimes the thing I find most commonly is it'll make it a perfect circle, but it'll twist your stuff like really weird like this or something, which is just like kind of gross to work with, honestly. But yeah, so anywho, that's the circularize tool. And it's good. Cool. Just gonna round that out a little more because it makes me happier. All right, so in this case, I'm just gonna say that this is pretty much good enough for the shape. I'm gonna actually save this. The computers always default to binary files. Grr. Normally Maya tries to save your scenes in the scenes folder, so I'm just going to make a scenes folder really quick and save my file in it. Cool. All right, so now I have this flat piece of handle here. So to give it thickness, my default sort of go-to has been select the whole object and just extrude it. And you'll see over here there's an option for local translate Z. And most of the time, I say most of the time, it will do a pretty decent job of creating like a shell of your object with a relatively uniform thickness. Most of the time. So I'm just going to run down here. So you can find local translate Z in this poly extrude faces box, or you can just click the blue handle, which is what I usually do, because I am lazy. I like little blue handles. Cool. So I'm just going to say that looks like maybe about the thickness that you'd expect. And you'll notice that, again, it has reversed the normals on my object, so I'm just going to go to Mesh Display and Reverse. So here is the super awesome looking bottom of this hole punch. So I'm going to show you guys really quick. So like this would be, I'm going to say a reasonable model. Like if you're trying to do like a low poly game model, what we have here would probably be pretty reasonable for that. Strictly speaking, you could reduce more polys, but meh. So if you wanted to do smooth modeling, so like for an animation, or if you're like getting really up close and you don't want to see all of this sort of faceted stuff in this hole, you'd want to use the 3 key. And the 3 key will smooth out your object in the same way. So I'm going to duplicate this again. It's basically trying to subdivide your mesh, and subdividing is like when the computer kind of interpolates and adds more edges in between the edges you have. So if you go to Mesh, Smooth, you can see that it'll add just like a bunch of geometry in. Turn on this little view here. So here we have the original low poly version of this model. Then you have the smoothed version of the model. And you can see that it's round and smoother, but it has the same general topology as the original that we made. And then here's the subdivided one. It looks smoothed, but this is still just the... this is not smoothed with the 3 key. It's just so freakishly dense that you don't even notice that it's not like a nice curve unless you get like really super zoomed in on it. For this class, there is really no reason you should ever need to subdivide your mesh like this, ever. Yeah, but I don't know. It has its purposes. It's like, usually you'd subdivide your mesh if you are throwing it into something that doesn't have like 3 key smoothing enabled. So like if you were putting it into a game and you needed something to look smoother, you would need the extra geometry in there. Or if you're going to sculpt like if you want to go back into like ZBrush or something like that and like sculpt in a bunch of really fine details, sometimes you'll subdivide your mesh really dense and then you can pretty much freely sculpt on the surface, if that makes sense. But yeah. So usually, any questions on that? It's kind of a weird, rambling description. All right. So a lot of times, if you're smoothing with the 3 key and you're going to use this for like a nice rendered animation or whatever, you need to add in some extra edge loops. So do you notice on the original metal bit we have here, the edge is nice and hard and it looks like it has some thickness to it. But if you look over here, it's like super thin and kind of pointy and awkward looking. So that's just a function of how smoothing works. To fix that, you need to add in extra edge loops. And I think, I actually forget, did I talk about this last class with you guys? With the smoothing and the extra edge loops? I'll go over it again now, okay. I can't remember, I talked about it with some of my classes and not others. I don't remember which. Anyway, all right, so like as a demonstration, so if I had this plane here, and I just made like, cool, here's like an awkward little kind of wall-esque looking item. Take that, duplicate it. I'm gonna smooth the second one I made. So you'll notice that it's the smooth version. Again, same geometry, it's just 2 planes, but this is really, really like ooey and like a very soft corner. So what you normally do to sort of compensate for that is you need to add in extra edge loops. And the general rule is you need 3 edge loops to quote unquote hold an edge. So you need 1 loop to actually define where your edge is. So in this case, this little center loop here, I will select it. So this loop here is the one that's like defining where I want the edge to be. And I would need then 1 edge loop on either side of this loop to soften it however much I want. So if I go into Mesh Tools, Insert Edge Loop, you can see so here's an edge loop that's like really, really close to that edge. You can see that makes it pretty significantly harder. If I undo that and then I add an edge loop like up here, it does not harden the edge as aggressively. So the harder you want the edge, the closer the edge loops need to be to each other. The softer you want the edge, the farther they should be from each other. So in this case, I'm just going to say maybe I'm making like here's like a nice soft background for shooting like camera lighting or something like that. A lot of times I'll just make it with like a plane and then like 2 edge loops to hold everything together. So does that kind of make sense with the smoothing? Cool. Die. All right. So if I wanted to go through and smooth this guy here, I'm just going to Control 1 that and move that back where it was. And this is another thing where like when you have to come back and do this, it helps a lot to have your topology set up nicely. And I think for now, that's just going to be one of the things where it's like kind of the more you do it, you'll learn what works and doesn't work. I kind of set this up like reasonably, not terribly, because I knew I was going to come back and smooth it later, but you'll get used to it the more you work with stuff. So, the first thing I'm going to start with is just this little edge here. So like obviously I don't want it to be this thin and ridiculous. So all I'm going to do, I'm going to start with an edge loop here on this edge, and you'll notice that even just adding that in makes it a lot harder and a lot less very awkwardly thin at the edge. And a lot of times with really, really thin edges like this, I will 100% cheat and be like, these are close enough, I'm just going to tack one edge loop in the middle and that counts for both. Cool. So you can see now that this is a much nicer, more natural looking edge. A lot of times, so, God, I completely forgot about this until now. When I took this class, it was explained like nothing in the world has perfectly flat, hard edges. Like if you look at, pretty much pick up anything in the room, and nothing is a perfect 90-degree angle, and that's why you should smooth everything you make for animations. Like if you had a cut piece of wood, like the edges should be ever so slightly rounded. If you are, for some reason, modeling a block of cheese, you should slightly round the edges. Like with games, this is not as much of a thing that people do because you're usually trying to be efficient with your edge loops, but for animation, it's just like, nothing should be hard-edged. Ooh, I kicked my flash drive. Anyway, so that would be how you would harden that edge. And then you can see, so there's another edge in here. And this is like literally, it is just tedious to do, but you pretty much need to go find every edge that needs to be hardened and just add in like a million loops. So like in this case, sometimes the insert edge loop tool only works for me if I'm not smoothing my model at the time. I don't know why. But like here, so gotta harden that edge a little bit, and then this one in here also needs to be hardened. I'll find you an example. Actually, I have an example sort of built into my computer. So one thing that you'll notice, so if you're looking at this edge, if perhaps you want, see how this is like also a really soft corner in here? In here it looks maybe, we're going to pretend like this looks a little bit sharper in here. So I'm going to add another edge loop, I'm going to turn symmetry on, and then I'm going to add another edge loop in here. So if I wanted that to be a harder corner, that extra edge loop would accomplish that. And then again, pretty much the same thing for like in this little hole here. I'm going to add another edge loop. And the one thing with holes that makes them kind of weird, or like cylinders, is sometimes it doesn't like adding extra edge loops. Like if I tried to add an edge loop around here like this, it wouldn't do it. So there's a way that I usually cheat it, and that's to just do an extrude. Turn symmetry off for this. But I'm just going to extrude, and then scale on all but this one axis, whatever this yellow one is. And when I smooth it, you can see that it's hardened the edge. That's just sort of like my silly cheat way to add an edge loop in there. Because the insert edge loop tool pretty much only works if you have, it only likes quads. So quads being something like this plane here. So it just has 4 edges, 4 vertices and 4 edges. If I were to delete one of these vertices, this is a try. It has 3 vertices, 3 edges. This is incidentally what most games thrive off of. There is one other thing that can exist, and it is called an Endgun, and Endguns are bad. So like this is an Endgun. I think this has like 7 or 8 edges in it. It's like 7 or 8 vertices, 7 or 8 edges, and no loops on the inside of this. Another, like Endguns are kind of awful because they don't smooth well. and they're just all around gross. If you're ever animating a character and you need to like bend this, Maya like doesn't know how to bend it because it's computationally a very gross thing to do. Don't put Endguns in your stuff. Stick to quads or tries. Any question on what quads and tries or Endguns are? Cool. One place that I tend to see a lot of Endguns in people's stuff is like the tops of cylinders. So like if I were to just delete the edges on top of that cylinder, like this is like the mother of all Endguns. And it's bad. Like if I smooth that, it does some really weird stuff. But yeah, so Endguns are bad. There. Which one is my smooth version? There we go. Cool. Alright, cool. So I'm just gonna really quick go through and just like smooth this because I apparently can't help myself. Alright. So that's basically like half of my hole punch done. You'll notice, so like when you smooth stuff and you add more edge loops, like right here, it makes kind of a hard crease in your model, which you may or may not want. In this case, I don't necessarily want that. And there are two ways that I usually fix this. One, which is probably the more quote-unquote correct way to fix it. Again, turn on symmetry because I don't want to redo this like 8 times. I'll just select these vertices and I will just scale them kind of away from each other. Again, this is like a really awkward way to do that. But you'll notice, so like you can kind of see over here, see how it's like a sharper edge right in here, and then in this one it's less sharp. And that's just because the vertices are, it's like that little plane demonstration I did. So the farther the edges away from each other, the the softer the curve is going to be. So in this first one, you see the edges are pretty close to each other, so it makes like a harder line in your model. But when you scale them away from each other like this, it will be a softer curve. I think that's just that's just the explanation I'm going to stick with for now. Cool. So that's pretty much half of the little cutter bit. Any questions on any of the tools or process stuff we've gone over so far? Cool. I'm probably also not going to make this entire hole punch in class, because a lot of it is kind of repetitive making things, but I'm going to run through and see like what other bits of this might be useful as like a demo thing. Alright, so kind of close enough for that, I guess. The other thing that you'll notice is, so like this was supposed to be a sort of smoother curve, but it's a little bit like this, it sort of hardens, it's like flattish here and like on these corners here. And that's, again, it's just because I have a really high concentration of edge loops in this area here and not so much in here. So all I'm going to do for this is just grab these vertices or edge loops and just rotate them out into a slightly rounder shape. And you can see now when I smooth it, it actually looks much more rounded than it did 10 seconds ago. So yeah, I mean, that's pretty much that. I think I might, cool. So any questions on the hole punch for now? Oh, I can smooth this. So ideally, I think for this upcoming assignment, for assignment 2, which is like, again, model a random object, I think it would make sense, if you're an anim kid, I think it would make sense to try to do, to smooth your object. And then if you are game, you can smooth it if you want to get practice, or you can do a low poly version of this, which is pretty much the same thing, just don't smooth it. But yeah, if you, in general, the slightly vague and arbitrary thing of defining things. So like, if you want to do a low poly version of this, so like here's my original sort of low poly version. I would want to see, so like on something rounded like this, I would want to see the edge loops spaced equidistant from each other. So like this part's super nice and rounded, and this part's like really chunky. I would go through again on this and just like drag these, at least make them kind of spaced equidistantly, so it's like a little bit more uniform. And then any areas where there's like a curve or something like that, like it might not help, or it wouldn't be bad to have like a few more edge loops in here, just because like these polygons are like pretty obvious, like where they come and where they're pointed, if that makes sense. And then perhaps a few more loops in this little sphere area as well. I don't know. I have examples that should be linked in the Google Drive about like the quote-unquote nice ways to make stuff look low poly, or what I would qualify the nice way is. But like, I'm trying to find a happy medium where you guys get to practice low poly modeling, and the game department is also appeased, or like the overlords of this class in the anim department are also like, cool, your models aren't super low poly and gross looking. So I'm trying to like find that happy medium. But yeah. If you do, so really quick, just if you do end up making your whatever your object is low poly. So like here is just a default cube. I'm gonna go through really quick and smooth this cube. Smoothing the cubes. Smoothing desks and cubes is like the actual worst thing ever. Oh my god. There's like so many pieces of stuff. Erg. Okay, whatever. I was being a jerk. Smoothed-ish cube. You can cheat that sort of effect if you're doing like a game model with beveling. So if you just select your edge, go to Edit Mesh Bevel, or do Control B. And you can see, you can have options here for like how large do you want the bevel, how many segments do you want. The more segments you have, the smoother it's going to look. But yeah, so that's also another way to either get nicely spaced, curves in your stuff. Like if I were modeling a phone charger or something, like grab these. I'm doing like, if I were trying to model like a little iPhone charger or something like that, you could be like, boom, that's the rough shape of an iPhone charger. So that's a good thing to use if you're doing low poly modeling. Just be aware that beveling will create Endguns in your stuff. The super hacky, gross way to like fix this particular Endgun would just be to, not the best way to fix this, but you could extrude, so you just have like another little face, and then pretty much just do a merge to center, and it will seam your stuff. So now you have tris and quads, but you have no Endguns. That makes sense? Cool. Endguns are evil. I want to see no Endguns on people's things. I will find them if they're there. No, but yeah, so Endguns are bad. The other thing that's like generally good modeling process and going forward, if I see your stuff with flat planes that are not extruded, I will dock points going forward. So like if you had basically this shape before I extruded it, all right, wait, go back and remake this shape real quick. So like if you if you were modeling the hole punch and you submitted something like this, where it wasn't extruded, it's very clearly just like a flat plane in a shape, I would take points off for that. Because nothing in... I'm usually lenient about the, like, nothing in the world, even like a slice of metal, has perfect edges or whatever, like perfect 90-degree angles. But nothing in the world is a flat plane like this. Even a piece of paper has some thickness to it. So I want to see you guys at least dragging your stuff and just like extruding your whole object. Like, at least do that at a bare minimum. So like if you were, yeah. Even if you're making like a piece of paper or something, you could literally just give it like a .001 extrusion or something, or like a .01, and be like, boom, here's a thin slice of paper. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? Cool. Because I will totally, pretty much.